Imagine being a scientist, right?
Yeah.
You are locked in a prison cell for 20 months.
Yeah, almost 2 years.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And your crime, it's not, building a dangerous weapon or stealing state secrets or like leading a riot.
Yeah.
Your crime is literally just having a PhD, using a VPN, and clicking retweet to an audience of fewer than 100 followers.
It is wild.
It is. Welcome to today's deep dive. We are really thrilled to have you with us because today we are exploring a scenario that honestly sounds like a chapter pulled straight out of some dystopian novel. But it's actually happening in the real world.
Yeah, we are basically looking at this massive fundamental collision between the rigid machinery of a state legal system and, well, the mind of a complexity physicist.
Right.
It's this incredible story about what happens when an institution that demands absolute certainty tries to prosecute a scientist whose entire worldview is built on, probability and skepticism.
So our mission for this deep dive is to explore the really remarkable case of Dr. Chen Jingyuan. To unpack his story, we've got a fascinating stack of sources sitting right in front of us.
Lots of reading.
So much reading. We're looking at the official legal documents,
Yep.
so the indictment and the court verdicts. We also have Dr. Chen's own 20,000-word blood letter, which is this dense, cross-disciplinary defense that he actually wrote by hand.
From inside his prison cell, which is just staggering to think about.
Yeah, mind-blowing. And to help us sort of synthesize all this, we are drawing on a collection of meta-analyses generated by multiple AI language models. We basically fed these case files into ChatGPT, DeepSeek, Gemini, and Grok to examine the events through, legal, scientific, and psychological lenses.
But before we jump into the specifics, I think I need to clarify how we are approaching this material for you, the listener.
Good point, yeah.
Because, our sources contain some pretty politically charged content regarding the Chinese judicial system and state actions. We are absolutely not going to take any political sides today.
Right, totally impartial.
Exactly. Our sole purpose is to impartially report on the ideas, the facts, and the AI-generated analyses that are contained in these documents. We are just here to explore the profound philosophical and psychological themes at play when, an individual intellect collides with a massive state apparatus.
Okay, let's unpack this. We need to start with the basic timeline because I think the contrast between the actual physical events and the sheer weight of the legal response is, well, it's staggering.
It really is.
So it is September 2022. Dr. Chen is just at his home. And suddenly, a squad of police officers literally breaks through his door.
They raided the house.
Yeah, they raid his house, they confiscate his computers and his phones, and he is eventually charged with what the legal system over there refers to as a pocket crime.
Yeah.
Specifically, picking quarrels and provoking trouble.
Right. And a pocket crime, just for context, is essentially this catch-all legal offense. It is deliberately broad. It's designed to capture behaviors that the authorities deem disruptive, but that might not fit neatly into, specific criminal categories like theft or assault.
Okay, I see.
But to justify a charge that severe, you really have to look at the evidence the police actually extracted from his devices. The entire foundation of this case rested on sporadic retweets on a Twitter account.
Just retweets.
Just retweets. Dr. Chen accessed this account via the VPN, and he was completely obscure online. I mean, he had fewer than 100 followers.
Wow.
And the AI analysis of his account metrics shows that the vast majority of those followers were actually inactive automated zombie accounts.
Okay, so I am trying to picture the actual threat level here. I mean,
Yeah.
he isn't organizing a militia. He's not publishing classified documents. The police literally break down a door for a shadow banned account. What exactly was in these retweets?
Well, when the AI models, specifically Gemini and DeepSeek, when they categorized the evidence, they found the retweets basically fell into a few really mundane buckets.
Like what?
So the first was artistic expression. For example, he retweeted a comic illustration of an umbrella girl from the Hong Kong protests, and then a political caricature featuring Xi Jinping and Donald Trump.
Okay, so just art.
Yeah. The second bucket was emotional expressions, like he shared an image of a candle to commemorate June 4th.
Right.
The third was theoretical commentary. So this included links to academic articles and a speech on communism. And the final bucket was just historical documents. Stuff like records of Mao Zedong's editing history and photos of old pension slips.
But, I mean, none of that is original content. He didn't draw the caricature, right? He didn't write the academic articles.
No, not at all.
He just clicked a button to share them. But wait, if the law for this specific charge requires a person to fabricate or spread false information, how does clicking retweet on a political cartoon qualify as spreading a factual lie.
It doesn't, logically.
Right, because you can't fact-check a drawing of a politician. I mean, it is like getting a speeding ticket for a car that is parked in your driveway just because the car has a racing stripe and it looks fast.
That is a great analogy.
Yeah.
And you are basically arguing with a judge who insists the parked car is a public menace just because of the paint job. This is actually the crux of the issue that the AI legal analyses bring up. DeepSeek and Gemini highlight that the court committed a massive category mistake.
A category mistake. What does that mean in this context?
So in philosophy and logic, a category mistake is when you assign a property to a thing that cannot possibly possess that property.
Okay, I follow.
You cannot legally classify subjective opinions or artistic expression in historical debates as verifiable objective rumors. A caricature cannot be objectively true or false in a scientific sense, you know?
Right. It's just an opinion or a joke.
Exactly. By treating subjective exploration as a deliberate falsehood, the court essentially criminalized the act of wondering.
So they take this category mistake and they use it to justify the whole prosecution. But even within their own legal framework, the mechanics of how they actually secured a conviction, I mean, it just doesn't seem to hold up.
Not at all.
If you are charged with picking quarrels by spreading false information online, don't the Chinese judicial guidelines actually have very specific thresholds?
They do. And this is where the logic of the prosecution just completely unspools. The law actually sets both objective and subjective requirements.
Okay, break that down for me.
Objectively, your action must cause a severe disorder of public order, and the judicial guidelines quantify this threshold. To qualify as severe disorder, a piece of false information typically needs to be retweeted 500 times or viewed 5,000 times.
Okay, so they're hard numbers.
Yes. And subjectively, the law requires knowing intent. The defendant must know the information is a lie and share it anyway to cause harm.
But wait, we just established his account was a total ghost town. He has under 100 followers, and they're mostly bots.
Right.
He didn't hit 500 retweets. I mean, he likely didn't even hit 5. His retweets were going into an absolute void.
Total void.
So how did the court prove he caused a severe public disorder? And how on earth did they prove he did it with malicious knowing intent?
Well, they couldn't prove it with data. So they substituted data with this astonishing logical leap based purely on his identity.
His identity.
Yeah. Because Dr. Chen did not have the viral reach required by the statute, the court argued that his educational background somehow filled the evidentiary gap.
What?
Seriously. The judge reasoned that because Dr. Chen has a PhD and a high level of academic training, he possesses the intellect to, easily distinguish right from wrong.
Oh, come on.
Therefore, the court concluded he must have knowingly spread false information. They essentially used his academic credentials as a weapon against him to presume his guilt.
Okay, I'm going to play devil's advocate for a second here. Let's try to look at it from the perspective of a judge who is just trying to maintain order.
Sure.
Couldn't a court reasonably argue that a highly educated researcher, a professional scientist, has a higher burden of responsibility? Shouldn't a guy with a PhD be expected to, thoroughly fact-check his sources before broadcasting them to the public?
That sounds completely reasonable on the surface until you look at how Dr. Chen dismantled that exact premise in his own defense.
Oh.
In his 20,000-word letter, he didn't apologize for failing to know the absolute truth. Instead, he argued that a true scientist is fundamentally a skeptic.
Right, they question things.
Exactly. A PhD doesn't grant you omniscience. It teaches you the vast limits of human knowledge. And to prove this to the court, he actually brought in Kurt Gödel's incompleteness theorems.
Okay, wow. You're dropping some heavy math here. How does a mathematical theorem from the 1930s get used as a defense against a social media charge?
It is so brilliant when you break it down. Gödel's theorems mathematically prove that within any complex logical system, there will always be statements that are true, but can never be proven within that system.
Okay, let me...
So basically, mathematics itself proved that you can never have a totally closed, perfect system of absolute certainty. Dr. Chen combined this with the philosophy of John Locke and David Hume to argue that absolute certainty in human knowledge is just a myth.
So he is basically telling the judge, look, my PhD didn't teach me everything. It actually taught me that I cannot know everything with absolute certainty.
That is exactly his defense. He is arguing that because he understands the limits of epistemology, he cannot absolutely know the objective truth of complex global events or historical debates or political theories.
Which makes sense.
Right, so therefore, it is legally and philosophically impossible for him to possess the knowing intent to spread a definitive lie. Because definitive, absolute truth is beyond human grasp.
That is a fascinating way to look at it.
And when the AI models analyzed this portion of the trial, they uniformly flagged the court's logic as a really dangerous presumption of guilt. Models like Grok and Copilot actually noted that the court illegally shifted the burden of proof.
How so?
Instead of the state proving he knew he was lying, they forced him to prove he didn't know, based entirely on the assumption that a smart person should just know everything.
Man, so Dr. Chen uses high-level philosophy to prove he couldn't have had malicious intent. But the court is still claiming he caused a severe disorder of public order. So when logic and philosophy fail to sway a judge, what does a physicist do? He turns his own courtroom into a laboratory. He literally tries to prove his innocence using physics.
And this is where Dr. Chen's defense transcends standard legal argument. In his blood letter, he stops arguing like a lawyer, and he starts arguing like a complexity scientist.
Here's where it gets really interesting.
Yes, he applies network topology and the dynamics of self-organized criticality directly to the social media landscape.
Okay, we need to translate this for a second. Network topology and self-organized criticality. Let's walk through how this actually functions in normal terms.
So think about how information spreads. Dr. Chen used something called the Galton-Watson extinction theorem.
The Galton-Watson theorem, okay.
Right. In network theory, if you want a piece of information to cause a systemic avalanche, which would be the scientific equivalent of the court's severe public disorder, you have to look at the average branching number. This is very similar to the R0 value we talk about in viral epidemiology.
Oh, like with COVID.
Exactly. For an outbreak to turn into a full pandemic, every infected person has to infect more than one other person on average.
Right, because if the R0 is below 1, the virus just eventually hits a dead end, and the outbreak naturally extinguishes itself.
The exact same mathematical principle applies to a social network. For a retweet to cause public disorder, the average branching number has to be greater than 1. Every single person who sees the tweet has to share it with more than one person continuously, creating this massive cascade.
But Dr. Chen is starting with an audience of dead bots and, like, a few dozen real people.
Which means mathematically, his account is what physicists call a fringe node. He calculated that his average branching number was just a tiny fraction of 1. In physics terms, his account existed in a deep subcritical zone.
Okay, let me see if I have this visual right. If you want to start a massive forest fire, you need dry wood, you need wind, and a spark. That is a critical zone.
Yes.
Dr. Chen is arguing that his Twitter account is like striking a single match inside a damp, underground cave.
Exactly.
The math dictates that the flame will just go out. It cannot physically burn down the forest.
That is the perfect way to visualize it. Dr. Chen mathematically proved that the probability of his sporadic retweets triggering a systemic avalanche approaches absolute zero. It is not just unlikely, it is a physical impossibility for his actions to have caused the severe public disorder the state accused him of.
He actually uses his own analogy in the sources, and it is pretty witty for a guy literally fighting for his freedom.
It is.
He says that the court blaming his tiny Twitter account for severe public disorder is like accusing a single person of causing global warming just because they breathe out carbon dioxide.
I love that one.
Right? Like, yes, technically I am exhaling carbon into the atmosphere.
Yeah.
But to hold me criminally responsible for the melting of the polar ice caps is just scientifically absurd.
And the AI consensus strongly highlights this underlying friction here.
Yeah.
You basically have two completely incompatible ways of seeing the world.
Yeah.
On one side, you have a rigid institutional system that operates on a binary code of absolute compliance and unquestioned authority. It demands certainty.
Right, black and white.
But on the other side, you have a scientific mind that understands the physical world entirely through probabilities and margins of error, critical thresholds, complex network dynamics. The court spoke the language of absolute control, and Dr. Chen spoke the language of physical reality.
So Dr. Chen mathematically proves his innocence. He shows that the charges are philosophically bankrupt and, frankly, physically impossible. But the state holds the keys to his cell and they lock him up anyway.
Which is the tragedy of it.
Yeah, and this brings us to a massive psychological question. When flawless logic fails against absolute power, how does a highly rational mind keep from breaking?
To understand how he survived that, The AI meta-analyses shifted their framework entirely. Instead of looking at this through a legal or a physical lens, they applied positive psychology.
Positive psychology.
Right. This is a branch of psychology pioneered by people like Martin Seligman, and it draws really heavily on the existential work of Viktor Frankl, the psychiatrist who survived the concentration camps.
Now, traditional psychology usually focuses on trauma, right? Like,
Right.
it looks at how a terrible event fractures a person's psyche.
Yes, that is the traditional disease model of psychology. You always
Right.
look for the damage. But the AI models evaluated Dr. Chen using a strengths model. They applied the PERMA model.
What does PERMA stand for?
So PERMA stands for positive emotion, engagement, relationships, meaning, and achievement. They also use the VIA character strengths framework to analyze his 20,000-word letter.
Okay, so looking for the good.
Exactly. Despite being in an incredibly restrictive, isolated environment, Dr. Chen did not exhibit a broken psyche. He displayed immense character strength. The analysis specifically highlighted his wisdom in maintaining his intellectual curiosity and his courage in refusing to sign a false confession just to get a lighter sentence.
I am struggling with one of the concepts the AI highlighted, though. It mentioned his capacity for transcendence.
Yeah.
Usually I associate a word like transcendence with monks meditating on a mountain somewhere, not a physicist trapped in a concrete prison cell. How does someone achieve transcendence when their daily reality is completely stripped of all agency?
He achieves it through a psychological mechanism called meaning-making, which is a core component of post-traumatic growth.
Meaning-making.
Yeah, post-traumatic growth is a concept developed by psychologists Tedeschi and Calhoun. It is the idea that people can actually undergo profound, positive psychological change as a direct result of struggling with highly challenging life circumstances.
But how does writing a massive letter that he knows the judge will completely ignore lead to positive psychological change?
Because he changed the audience in his own mind. Dr. Chen did not write his blood letter with the naive hope that his mathematical proofs would convince the judge to just set him free.
He better.
He understood the system was closed and irrational, so he reframed the entire exercise. He decided he was writing a historical document. He wrote it for future readers, for sociologists, for legal scholars, for us.
Wow.
By reframing his suffering from a personal, pointless tragedy into a documentation of a civilizational breakdown, he hacked his own brain's survival instinct.
He essentially stepped outside of his own suffering to become a reporter on his own condition.
And by doing that, he achieved what psychologists call a state of flow.
Like being in the zone.
Exactly, a state of deep, immersive engagement with his work. Even while physically incarcerated, his mind was completely free. He elevated his individual plight into a matter of historical and philosophical meaning.
So what does this all mean? The psychological analysis seems to suggest that while the judicial system clearly won the physical battle by throwing him in jail, Dr. Chen achieved a complete psychological victory.
I would agree with that.
But there is a broader tragedy here that goes way beyond one man in a cell.
Absolutely. The AI models point this out very clearly. The judicial system in this case operated on a massive negativity bias and a deficit focus.
Right.
It looked at a naturally curious, highly educated mind engaging with complex global ideas, and the system saw nothing but a threat to its own order. By actively punishing human curiosity, skepticism, and critical thinking, the system is not just harming Dr. Chen.
It's harming everyone.
Yes, it is actively suppressing the potential for collective human flourishing. It is basically a bureaucracy designed to mandate ignorance in the name of stability.
You are punishing the exact qualities, skepticism, curiosity, the ability to synthesize multiple viewpoints that a society absolutely relies on to innovate, to grow, and to solve complex problems.
To synthesize all of this for you, what our sources and the AI analyses reveal is that this was never simply a localized legal case about a few dozen retweets.
Yeah.
It was a profound stress test of human resilience. We are looking at a dramatic, real-world collision between a rigid institutional paradigm that demands blind obedience and the open, questioning, probabilistic nature of scientific truth.
Which leaves us with a lingering thought about our own daily habits. Every single day, you and I leave massive digital footprints. We like posts, we bookmark articles, we retweet things we agree with.
Or disagree with.
Right, sometimes we share things we violently disagree with just to show our friends how absurd they are. But if our entire digital lives, years of sporadic clicks, late-night scrolling, and fleeting interests were suddenly scooped up and put under a microscope by a giant bureaucracy desperate to find a pattern of guilt, I mean, how would our natural, messy human curiosity look to a machine completely devoid of context?
It's a terrifying thought.
It really makes you wonder, In our hyper-connected digital age, is the freedom to simply wonder, to explore an idea without guaranteeing you agree with it, quietly becoming a radical act?
It is a question that Dr. Chen's story forces us to confront, because when the simple act of exploring a thought is criminalized, wondering itself becomes a form of resistance.
A huge thank you to you, our listener, for joining us on this deep dive. It's a heavy topic, but an incredibly important one to chew on. Keep wondering, keep exploring, and we'll catch you next time.